Good morning, everyone. I really want to thank Dale for inviting me to speak today because there's nothing like talking about cybersecurity to a room full of cybersecurity experts. It's intimidating and it can be fun. It's intimidating because you guys have robust situational awareness about the domains you're experts in. But maybe it'll be a little bit fun because perhaps I can give you a slightly different lens from which to look at the same data, the same facts, the same trends, the same events that we're all looking at every day. So my lens is that of national security. And today, that includes war, modern warfare, and international conflict. Over the past 2 decades, driven in a large part by the internet revolution, we have set the conditions for modern warfare, and it's all playing out in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, modern conflict is simply going to be different than anything we've seen before. When most people think about war, they think about guns and tanks and missiles, not electrons. But it's electrons. It's cyber that's going to change the face of modern warfare, and it requires us to adjust our perspective. There's 3 ways in which cyber is changing war that I want to touch on today. There's a lot more, but these are the 3 that I want to focus on. The first is technology, the second is social media, and the third is data. Now, I have this slide up, not just because I love standing in front of it for absolutely as long as possible, but also because the hack of Russian car charging stations was the first time an IoT hack took place in the context of war. And this hack didn't just deface these car charging stations. It meant that Russians couldn't charge their cars. It meant that Russians couldn't drive their cars. This hack also highlights another theme that I'm going to hit on repeatedly today, and that's the increasing privatization of war capabilities. Okay, so let's start with technology. Now, you guys have all seen some version of this slide before, right? By 2025, it's predicted that we're going to have somewhere between 27 billion and 37 billion connected devices. You all also know that the growth in IoT devices expands the cyber threat landscape. Now, when you put on the lens of modern conflict, the rate of growth of connected devices, the expanding hyper-connected ecosystem that we all live in, is inherently fragile, more fragile with each connected device. And this fragility creates the foundational risk and the foundational opportunities in modern war. Who would have thought that electric car charging stations would act as an attack vector during a war? Now, as we look to the future of smart cities, we can imagine a time when these attacks are going to be more than just mere annoyances, but represent the possibility of systemic failure for our cities. Peter Singer and August Cole wrote a book called Burn-In, which explores this topic, and I recommend everyone read it. Here's another slide you guys have all seen some version of before, right? It's the expanding drumbeat of cyber attacks, of breaches, of ransomware attacks, of IP theft, of data theft. What's interesting when you look at it from the lens of modern conflict is that privatization is blurring the lines between criminal and state actors and actions. Are Russian ransomware gangs just criminals, or are they proxies for the Kremlin? If the Colonial Pipeline hack took place today, would that count as an act of war? Would that invoke Article 5 of NATO and mean that both the US and Europe have been pulled into this conflict? We have never responded to criminal act with military response. It's just not how democracy works. But while our response to crime, to espionage, and to war is not unified, the use of crime and espionage as part of war, as part of strategic global competition, is becoming increasingly unified by our adversaries. A real-time example of this took place when early in the Russia-Ukraine war, the Russians hacked Viasat. Now, Biden had previously said that an attack on US infrastructure would lead to a US response. And with this attack, we see the complexity of that decision-making process. Does an attack on a US telecommunications company that primarily impacts Ukrainian and European customers count as an act of war? Does it warrant retaliation? Does it invoke Article 5 of NATO? The impact of this attack went far beyond Ukraine's borders. Does that mean that the war now has expanded beyond Ukraine's borders? Importantly, with the Viasat attack, we've witnessed cyber war extending into space for the first time, and we need to move quickly to secure space assets. Now, speaking of space, what happens when a US company provides critical capabilities to a country during wartime? Elon Musk, with Starlink, provides Ukrainians with a distributed and privatized communication alternative that's much more resilient to attack than Viasat. Now, one of the complexities of cyber war is this issue of attribution. Now, if you look on the left side, you'll see that with traditional military conflict, the TTPs for attribution are well understood. When we launch missile attacks, we can tell where they were launched from, whether it's land, air, or sea. Cyber is very different, and you can see that with the cyber attack slide. The physical location of the attack has very little to do with who's actually behind that attack. Now, here's a video of an attack that took place. Actually, it's not an attack, it's multiple attacks that took place a few weeks ago. If you look at this closely, you'll see that San Francisco is attacking New York. I actually think San Francisco at some point attacks Australia, while Brazil attacks the Midwest. Getting to perfect attribution in cyber is more like putting puzzle pieces together. We can do it. We're actually really good at it. But can we do it with the certainty that you need to justify military retaliation, especially retaliation that's timely, that's proportional, and that's accurate during an active conflict? Now, cyber attribution is further complicated by the fact that our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they deny that they were behind these attacks. It allows them to operate in the gray zone below the threshold of war. Keep in mind that once attribution is made, then the public expects action to follow. This is why we sometimes see the US government hesitating to attribute a particular attack to a particular actor, especially if it's the nation state. It's to manage escalation risk. And we saw that with Viasat, because while some cybersecurity firms have definitively said that Russia was behind the Viasat attack, the United States has not yet named Russia as the source of that attack. Attribution of that attack to Russia today creates a lot of complexity when you put on the lens of modern conflict. Now, I just touched on a few ways that tech transformation is impacting modern conflict. There's a lot of other ones, and we could spend days talking about it. The important thing to keep in mind is that the velocity of technology change, for the first time in human history, is outpacing our ability as humans to adapt and to gain mastery. Harvard professor E.O. Wilson famously said years ago, the real problem with humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, we have medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. And it's terrifically dangerous, and it's now approaching a point of crisis. Okay, so let's turn to the second area I want to discuss, and that's the transformation in social media, social engagement, and social interaction. What we have today is a social ecosystem that's dominated by a few technology platforms that are driving entirely new types of behavior that it turns out we're completely unprepared for. Some of these behaviors are authentic, but a lot of them are not. And that includes misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and flat-out lies. Keeping in mind, by the way, that false and negative news have a virality that truth can't match. Isn't that amazing, by the way, that we prefer false and negative news to the truth? That's our cognitive biases. And it's all changing not just social dynamics at a tremendous cost to our children, but it's also changing the face of war. This new social ecosystem can catch even the most sophisticated investors off guard, as was the case when we saw a raid on the securities market coordinated on Reddit that cost sophisticated investors $19 billion. Twitter can change history. On May 2nd, 2011, a Pakistani man tweeted live in Jalalabad that he was hearing and seeing helicopters in the middle of the night, which was a pretty rare thing. Now, that was as the US was preparing to raid bin Laden's compound. If either Osama bin Laden or the Pakistanis were paying attention to Twitter that night, the entire outcome of that mission and potentially history would have been very different. Now, social media can also have an incredibly positive outcome. Through the lens of modern conflict, the early lessons from the Ukraine war is that social media and information warfare can be a determinative factor in the outcome of conflict. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Zelensky's approval rating was 26%. After the invasion, it was over 90%. His selfies, his videos, his talks, together with all the images that were crowdsourced and stitched together, showing a united Ukraine fighting for freedom, have fundamentally changed the dynamics of this war in favor of Ukraine, which is otherwise completely outmanned and under-equipped in a traditional military sense. As a result of this InfoWar campaign, the Ukrainian public became mobilized. Germany went from committing a few helmets to committing anti-tank weapons. Switzerland, which had been neutral throughout World War II and in the face of Nazi atrocities, shed that historic neutrality and came out against the war. Even Halliburton suspended operations in Russia. Public sentiment has driven public policy and corporate policy in this war. And by winning the like war, the Ukrainians actually stand a fighting chance against Russia. Now, of course, we have to touch on deepfakes. Now, you guys have all seen the Obama and the Joe Rogan deepfakes, so I'm not going to share them with you. And a couple weeks ago, there was a really bad deepfake of Zelensky conceding the war floating around Facebook, but that got taken down pretty quickly. Now, we all know that the technology for deepfakes is ubiquitous, is out there. Anyone can do it. High school student, actually middle school student could probably make a deepfake these days. What I want to show you is a video that Thrasher magazine made about 4 years ago that can help us imagine what could happen here if you put some resources against the concept of deepfake.
Hey, I'm Glenn Larson. Today we'll be shooting Jeff doing a 360 inward healed on the legendary El Cabra stair set.
Right here. And pop.
That's what it takes to make these things look legit, you know? I think I was about 16 or 17 when I found out the truth about how skate videos are made. I mean, before I thought the 900 was actually a real trick. And I figured out it's just as fake as someone landing on the moon. All right.
Okay, was that real? Was it a parody? Maybe, maybe not, who knows? But the truth is that the human eye can't tell the difference anymore. And consider what happens when it's just not an individual making a deepfake, but you actually use resources, you use technology. It's going to get harder and harder to tell the difference between truth and lies. And by the way, if you think cyber attribution is hard, try mapping information flows. This is a network graph by the company Blackbird.ai that's tracking a narrative around Russia-Ukraine for one organization over a 2-week period. Each color represents an attribute. Red is misinformation. The other colors represents communities, personas, organizations, individuals. Traditional social media tools cannot grapple with the complexity of tracking these data flows and how they relate across social media platforms. The sophistication of the tools that are required to do this are truly next level. Okay, so let's turn to the third aspect of modern conflict that I want to talk about, and that's data. And I really want to focus on the intersection of physical and digital data and the fusion of those two things. It's hard not to be either incredibly impressed or incredibly terrified by how effectively China has fused the digital and the physical domains. China's social scoring system combines data and intelligences from a multitude of sources, correlates them in real time, applies intelligence, and analyzes it to generate a social score that determines in real time whether someone represents a threat to the state or whether they're trustworthy. And if you think that doesn't happen in the West, you're dead wrong. But it's just not driven by the government. The Faces of the Riot website was created by a teenager in Washington, D.C., who used open source intelligence and open source software to identify 6,000 pictures of people's faces at around the riot on January 6th. In a complete role reversal from China, the US citizens' use of surveillance technology informed the US government's understanding of what happened during the Capitol riots. In this case, the US government needed a distributed, decentralized, and privatized citizen army to help identify these individuals. And you know it gets more granular than that. The New York Times assembled a clear picture of how the combination of mobile phone data, advertiser data, and social media data can be used to fully reconstruct one man's participation in the riots from his home in Kentucky all the way to Washington, D.C., to his time at the Trump rally, all the way to the steps of the Capitol building, and with precision, his movements inside the Capitol building. Similarly, the Ukrainians have been able to track Russian troops using the same kind of technology that made Ronnie Vincent so easily trackable. Ad technology on phones has become targeting technology in war. Now, on the positive side, all of this data can also be used to establish ground truth when lies are so ubiquitous. Hawkeye 360 is a private company that uses a constellation of satellites to track radio frequency signals around the world. In April 2020, as Beijing announced that the pandemic was completely under control and that 70% of the ports in Wuhan were back up and operating, Hawkeye 360 imagery showed that they were not, that the port was essentially still shut down to traffic, basically unmasking Beijing's lies. The red dot the red circle is Wuhan, and you can see the difference between the traffic in Wuhan and the Shanghai ports. Once again, the power of privatization comes to life. With capabilities like those of Hawkeye 360, society has access to intelligence and information that used to be the sole purview of government. It used to be that only governments could track the assets of other governments. That's no longer the case. And think about the implications of that from the perspective of modern warfare. The ubiquity of satellite imagery is a game changer. SpaceX has now democratized satellite launches with low cost and frequent launches. You pay by the kilogram, you obtain a quote online, and today the price for launching a satellite is somewhere around $100,000 with off-the-shelf components that you can carry in your arms. You can task these satellites. By the way, you can task these satellites with apps like SpyMeSat using your smartphone, and as a result, close to 8 billion people have access to high-quality space imagery. Prices range from the hundreds of dollars to the thousands of dollars for images of varying quality, and they're available for purchase to anyone. The Iranian government used commercial satellite imagery to monitor Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq as it prepared to launch dozens of ballistic missiles against US and allied forces, coalition forces. Now just think about that. The Iranian government used commercial satellite imagery to target US forces. Planet Earth will soon be entirely instrumented from space to Earth, generating data which, when fused with intelligence, fundamentally transforms modern conflict, both from an offensive and a defensive perspective. We're used to living in a world where there have always been places and activities and locations that have been invisible to us. We're moving to a world where every square meter of planet Earth is instrumented and available to purchase for individuals. This means that secrecy is harder. This means that clandestine operations are harder. This means that deception is harder. Hours before Putin announced the start of special military operations on February 24th, a group of open source Intel analysts in California tracking traffic flows on Google Maps called out that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia had begun. Ukrainian Radio Watchers is a collection of private open source analysts who use software-defined radios to intercept unencrypted Russian radio communications to identify Russian plans and prevent the attacks, making signals intelligence, SIGINT, decentralized, distributed, and privatized. By the way, there's a really good question as to why the Russians are using unencrypted radio communications. And it either means that they just haven't modernized the way they'd led the world to believe, or that they're having problems encrypting and exchanging private keys. We'll find out at some point. Now let's play this forward. If you stitch together these three inputs to modern conflict, technology, social media, and data, what does it all mean as we look to the future? Looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what everybody wants to know is, how's this going to turn out? And maybe there was a time when you crunched enough numbers and you worked really, really hard, you could make reliable predictions. Today, with these new conditions for modern conflict, we need to assume that reliable predictions are really hard to make, and we have to embrace the fact that we live in the world of conditional probabilities. Now, anyone here a poker player? Anyone? So I play Texas Hold'em, try to as often as I can. I don't like Omaha. But you know what makes a great poker player, right? It's someone who's mastered the concept of conditional probabilities. And that's the world that we live in, except the velocity is changing. The cards are being dealt much more quickly. Some cards are dealt face up, some are dealt face down, but every single card changes the outcome of any given hand and requires us to reassess our next move. And great poker players don't just play their hand, they don't just play the cards, they play the player. Today, we're playing Russia and Putin. Their game is aggressive, but it's loose. That changes the outcome. The next hand might be against Beijing and Xi. They play an entirely different game. Their game is disciplined, it's professional, and it's tight. And they're playing to win the world tournament. And you can bet that they will reassess as every card is dealt. In 1945, Eisenhower's genius in planning for D-Day was recognizing the fact that plans don't survive first contact with the enemy. His willingness to adapt to the situation on the ground, unlike, say, the French and their Maginot Line, was the difference between victory and defeat for the Allies. When we don't adapt our thinking, when we suffer failures of imagination, horrible things can happen. When the first World Trade Center bombing happened in 1993, we assumed that it was an exception and that it would never happen again. These dangerous embedded assumptions we hold on to get in the way of our ability to be agile and to adapt. It's how we miss the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor. It's how we miss the rise of populism. It's how we dismiss the viability of a Trump candidacy over and over again. It's how we miss the threat that Al-Qaeda represented to the homeland. Agile software development is a methodology that allows us to code with a mindset of continuous adaptability. We will have to mirror this mindset of systemic experimentation with agile conflict response. And we have to make sure that we reduce unnecessary friction in decision-making as we move toward an agile and adaptive decision-making model, including in how we organize in the US government. General Nakasone, who's the commander of Cyber Command and director of NSA, recently testified to Congress that the unity of effort is critical in defending our nation, enabling the speed and agility necessary to meet the strategic challenges posed by our adversaries. We have great early examples of this. The Russia Small Group was a coordinated effort between NSA and Cyber Command that effectively interrupted Russian interference efforts with the 2018 midterm elections. Those lessons were carried forward to the 2020 elections, which they also effectively protected. In the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we have adapted our approach to intelligence, and it has paid off tremendously. Historically, the intelligence community held onto its collections very tightly. It was very close. We classify them, and we limit disclosure to a very small group of allies. And that happens for a really good reason. By sharing intelligence, you reveal sources and methods, and you risk putting people at risk and losing access that's by definition very hard to get and very hard to maintain. Real-time disclosure of classified information, which is what we've done in this war, is a stunning change in policy. By disclosing specifics about troop locations, about coup attempts, about false flag operations, the United States was able to claim a first-mover advantage in the information war space. And by doing that, we pre-bunked Putin's attempts at misinformation and disinformation. We informed the public, which has changed the dynamics of this conflict. We mobilized the Ukrainian public. We shored up faltering alliances and made it really hard for countries and organizations to stay on the sideline and get away with just making performative statements. We fundamentally changed the extent of the sanctions that were imposed. We armed the warfighters with the information they needed to defend their homeland. And we've potentially deterred certain actors and certain actions. We not only showcased our incredible intelligence community capabilities, but how those capabilities, with a different approach, can quickly change the situation on the ground. Looking at the situation on the ground, Ukraine is so massively outmatched and outmanned from a traditional military perspective. From their troops, their soldiers, they're outmatched 4-1. Their Air Force is outmatched 13-1. Their Navy is outmatched 16-1. Putin's assumption that this was going to be a 3-day war wasn't wrong from a traditional military perspective. But this isn't a traditional war. This is a modern war where cyber, technology, social media, and data and intelligence, some of it from government sources, but much of it distributed, decentralized, and privatized, has enabled a new set of conditions where, with constant experimentation, amazingly, Ukraine stands a chance. In this world of decentralized, distributed, and privatized, agile conflict response, interesting things can happen. Let's organize an army of hackers. This can happen either in coordination with the government or not. In this case, it was in coordination with the Ukrainian government. Some 400,000 multinational hackers have joined forces to support Ukraine's effort. By the way, that's twice the number of soldiers in Ukraine's army. Let's use Twitter to share lists of Russian and Belarusian targets. And just in case you're wondering whether a hacker army can actually make a difference, don't forget that one really, really angry hacker managed to take down North Korea's entire, albeit limited, internet. A hacker army can represent significant power that is immensely relevant in the context of modern conflict. And the next conflict is sure to be different. You can be sure that our adversaries are watching this war play out and taking away lessons, just as we are. China is not only watching Russia and all of their missteps, they're not only watching Ukraine and all of their early successes. They are watching how the US plays its hand and what kind of player we intend to be on the world stage. After watching how the US military performed during Operation Desert Storm, the Chinese government realized it had to overhaul its approach to military and move from a conventional military mindset to an informationalized military mindset. The lessons from this conflict will be different. Whether it's the effectiveness of drones, whether it's the fundamental issues with having a conscript army, or whether it's the importance of not ceding this cyberspace or information war space, you can be sure that Beijing will not make the same mistakes that the Kremlin has. Our adversaries will learn, they will adapt, and modern warfare will evolve again. Now, I want to end where I started. The velocity of change in society is accelerating at a pace that outstrips our ability as humans to adapt and to gain mastery. There was a time when we had centuries to adapt to new technologies. The printing press took 200 years to have global reach. The agricultural revolution also took 200 years. The industrial revolution was 100 years. Today, arguably, we have 4 simultaneous revolutions going on. We have the energy revolution, we have the AI quantum revolution, we have the biology revolution, and we have the media revolution. And it gets even more complex. In addition to all this technological upheaval, we're going through a period of intense social change with growing rifts in society. From social justice and income inequity to climate change, a global pandemic, the decline of democracy and freedom, the rise of authoritarianism and populism, and economic crises around the globe. These are seams in society that are ripe to being exploited in altogether new and devastating ways, leading to forms of conflict that we're entirely unprepared for. To protect the values we believe in, to protect freedom and democracy, we must be creative and agile with an altogether new way of looking at technology and its impact on society, on international conflict, and international relations. And guess what? Whether you want to be or not, you guys are the frontline forces. You're protecting our systems, you're protecting our data, you're protecting our people, you're protecting our organizations. And yeah, you're protecting freedom and democracy. And you can bet that the next adversary we face is taking the lessons from this war to heart. I hope you guys do as well. Thank you.